So Yuan Zhao is going to give a talk about non-corrupting decision-making feedback to area Emcee. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Carsen. Can you see my screen share?
Looks good.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for coming. So I'm gonna tell a story on a peculiar phenomenon we observed in the macaque middle temporal cortex. So here, this is collaboration with Huck Lab in UT Austin. Here, the punchline is we found the internal representation of motion stimulus is mostly misaligned with what we expect from an ideal sensory cortex. So you could imagine that our survivals rely on the brain generates proper behaviors depending on what we sense. The neural coding problem is a fundamental in understanding how the brain does that. In sensory systems, we often seek for a relation between the stimuli and neural responses to study the code. However, such analysis alone are prone to misleading conclusions because our ability to detect signal in neural activity is only a necessary condition and doesn't imply that the brain actually used this information. So it is critical to have a behavioral component in the experiments that we can quantify which aspect of the spatial temporal pattern of neural activity correlates with the behavior. So the sensory area Emcee has been studied for decades in this context. So as we know, Emcee is a critical bottleneck in visual motion perception through lesion and in activation studies. Then we seek analysis on the recording in the area Emcee while the monkey is performing a perceptual decision-making task. So in this task, the monkey started with a fixation at the center of the screen, and then it was given 7 pulses of drifting and flickering bursts consecutively. The monkey needed to accumulate and report the net direction of the motion in the end by a card. So get back to the question on the correlation between your activity and the behavior. We know that the Emcee activity is primarily driven by the stimulus during the experiments, but it correlates with the choice as well. Then how do we isolate and measure the correlation between neuron and choice? And we use the frozen trials and the choice probability. The frozen stimuli mean the same stimulus is repeated across trials. So there's no variability Emcee that is introduced by the stimuli, but there is also trial-to-trial variability for the frozen stimuli. And the choice probability is a measure of the separation between the distributions of Emcee activity conditional on the choices. For example, in this figure, you have 2 distributions conditional on the 2 choices. So 0.5 choice probability means you cannot discriminate between these 2 distributions, and 1 means there is a perfect separation and you can build a perfect decoder to decode a choice from the distribution. And there are studies that have found a substantial choice probability in Emcee neurons. Then the next question is, where the choice correlation comes from? Then here are 2 possibilities. One is that the choice information is generated within Emcee and read out by the downstream areas to generate behavior. The other is that the choice information is fed back to the Emcee from the downstream areas. However, these are hard to verify with only single neurons. So before we get to the results, let me explain some concepts. Imagine a population of 2 neurons. Each dot on the plane represents a pair of firing rates. Suppose the 2 neurons have a opposite preference on the direction of the stimulus. Then we can find a subspace within this space where the 1D stimulus is encoded. Of course, there are variabilities or noise contributing to the activity. So among the noises, some are in the same direction of the stimulus that distorts the stimulus information. Sometimes it's called information limiting noise. And some are orthogonal to the stimulus and harmless. If we only use these 2 neurons to make the choice, we can easily find the optimal decision boundary that is orthogonal to the stimulus subspace. So, yeah. Then, as we partition the space into stimulus and the null space, we also call the null space as non-stimulus subspace. And these 2 subspaces are orthogonal. We would also ask where the choice information resides in Emcee, or which subspace the choice information resides. So combining with this previous 2 possible sources of choice correlation, we came up with 4 hypotheses. So the first one, the optimal readout case. So here, the choice information resides in the stimulus subspace and read out by the downstream area perfectly. In this case, we should observe 0.5 choice probability in the non-stimulus subspace, but a higher choice probability in the stimulus subspace. And the other feedforward case is that the downstream areas are read out not so perfectly. So then the variability in the non-stimulus subspace also correlates with the choice. And therefore, we should observe a higher choice probability in the non-stimulus subspace as well. Then in the feedback cases, the choice information could be fed to the stimulus or the non-stimulus subspaces. And the feedback to stimulus subspace will corrupt the stimulus information in the stimulus subspace and thus inflate the choice probability in that subspace. But the feedback to the null subspace will not corrupting the stimulus information and only inflate the null choice probability in the null space, or in other words, in the non-stimulus subspace. Of course, here it doesn't completely rule out the corrupting cases, because the feedback can be the choice information can be fed back to both of the subspaces. And now let's look at the analysis we have done that rules out some of the possibilities. So we first extract a 4D latent factor from the population spectrum using so-called variational latent Gaussian processes. It is a dimensionality reduction tool that produces smooth latent factors. And we can see from the noise correlation matrix, we can see the 4D factors has already explained the noise correlation very well. Then the regression analysis on the latent factors shows that the stimulus is encoded in 1D in the latent space. Here on the left, it's the a real visual motion that was presented to the monkeys. Finally, we can align and map the factors for choice probability calculation. So after the extraction of latent factors, and we then align or we partition the factors into the stimulus subspace and the non-stimulus subspace. Then we did a so-called choice mapping to map the multi-dimensional factor to a 1D scalar that enables the calculation of choice probability. And those choice mapping preserve the choice information in the latent factors. And finally, we pull the mappings across sessions and did a statistical test in the nested model. So basically, the nested model tells if the outer model explains more than the inner model. So our finding, so the question is that if the non-stimulus subspace also contributes to choice, our finding says yes. We find a substantial and significant choice probability in the non-stimulus subspace. That meaning the sensory and choice population codes are misaligned. And that also rules out the two aligned subspace hypothesis. Then the question is the feedback corrupting or not? To answer the question, we also look at the time course of the choice probability in both subspaces. On the left, we observe this large late CP component in the non-stimulus subspace. So the timing suggests that the choice information is from the feedback way, and but the absence of the large component CP in the stimulus subspace give us a hint of non-corrupting feedback. So, but why that is the case? Why the feedback is non-corrupting? It might be useful for adaptation and learning. And also we did some new experiment, and we found that this pattern changes when the new behavior strategy is learned by the monkey, and the working as in progress. So to summarize, in this study, we found that the sensory and choice population code are misaligning Emcee, and the time course of choice probability supports non-corrupting feedback of decision-making process to the sensory area Emcee. And this concludes my talk. Thank you, and questions are welcome.
Thanks. That was a great talk. Are there any questions from anyone? I see there's one in the Q&A. Matteo Carandini asks, could it be orthogonal to sensory signals because it is motor, this feedback?
Yeah, that's possible because it could be the feedback from a downstream motor areas to the Emcee.
I guess that the follow-up to that might be, is the time course, this late time, is that when the saccade is happening? Is that aligned to when the saccade starts?
Yeah, that's a good point. The more we didn't look at the the choice probability time course near the saccade, but the new experiments we don't see a very late large CP component at the saccade time. So it might not be the case.
I have a question too.
Yeah.
So did you do any control experiments where you only present passive stimuli where the animal doesn't have to make a response to see if there are any changes in the non-stimulus coding subspace versus behaviorally relevant stimuli that do require a response?
We did some new experiment that forced the monkey to use early or delayed the pauses to perform the task, and the preliminary results showed that the monkey kind of changed the strategy. Among these different conditions.